To end and summarize this section, I want to discuss at a high level what it takes to learn reinforcement learning for real. Personally, I think it would be quite difficult to grasp reinforcement learning and understand it on an abstract level from just a single section of a single course. Let's start by recognizing that reinforcement learning is very different from supervised and unsupervised learning. Nowadays, when you're studying supervised and unsupervised learning, many beginner courses take the approach of avoiding how to implement the models. This is not a good approach because it doesn't prepare you for understanding real machine learning. Let's suppose the structure of the course is like this. First, you discuss the intuition behind how the model works, just some pictures and some descriptive ideas. Then, you learn how to use that model in scikit-learn, not including loading in the data or looking at the results. So what is the problem with this approach? Well, it allows you to not only make many mistakes and have serious misunderstandings about the content, but perhaps the biggest problem with this approach is that you will never know what those misunderstandings are. In other words, you are in a place where you don't know what you don't know. You don't know your mistakes, and hence you can't fix them. You're confident that you've learned something, but this is nothing but blissful ignorance. And again, these are just my observations of other students, so don't take it as a personal judgment of you. This is not so much a problem if that's how far you want to go. If you only ever plan on using APIs and you never want to become an actual professional, that's totally fine. Nobody is judging you. But it becomes a problem when it's time to stop using APIs. This turning point appears when you want to learn how to do reinforcement learning. There is no API for reinforcement learning, at least not yet. So what is one to do? Well, you have to implement those algorithms yourself. The problem is, if you have no experience implementing machine learning algorithms, reinforcement learning is not a good place to start. I want to also comment about the many blogs, tutorials, and so forth that exist out there attempting to teach you about reinforcement learning. Consider how long it took us in this section to go from nothing to Q-learning at a pace that I would consider as fast as possible. Compare that to the length of a typical blog tutorial. It should be clear that it would be impossible for a short blog post to include enough detail to get you to the point where you can actually implement reinforcement learning yourself. The best advice I can give you if you want to learn reinforcement learning for real is this. I would recommend taking a full course or multiple courses about reinforcement learning. Learn about basic tabular reinforcement learning before you move on to approximation methods. That will make understanding the concepts much easier. In this section, we spent most of our time discussing the concepts under the assumption that we were using a Q-table and not a neural network. You want to learn about the basic approaches to reinforcement learning, which can be categorized into number 1, dynamic programming methods, number 2, Monte Carlo methods, and number 3, temporal difference methods. And make sure to spend some time on implementation. After that, move on to approximation methods with linear models. Once you've done that, and you've implemented reinforcement learning algorithms with linear models, move on to using deep learning for function approximation. At this point, you should be very comfortable with the concepts, but implementation is still another matter entirely. Unlike supervised and unsupervised learning, reinforcement learning is very hard to get right, even if you are an expert programmer. It is very easy to introduce subtle bugs that are difficult or nearly impossible to track down. And of course, you don't have to take my word for it. Here's a post by Andrej Karpathy, probably one of the most famous reinforcement learning researchers, talking about just how difficult it can be. In this comment, another user talks about how they spent an entire year trying to get Q-learning to work with neural networks for a particular game. Many students who take my courses get frustrated when an exercise takes more than a few minutes. Now imagine working on something for 1 year. Andre responds to this comment and says, "It took me 6 weeks to get policy gradients working." And keep in mind, he's one of the world's leading researchers in reinforcement learning. He has all the state-of-the-art technology he needs on demand, and he's surrounded by other researchers who are just as smart as he is, so he can ask them for advice or to check his code at any time. So the key idea I want you to keep in mind is that as you learn reinforcement learning, realize that implementation is very non-trivial, even for experts. You should expect to spend a lot of time and effort trying to get things right.